block Michael, so I'm going to move over just a little.
Sure.
To be sharing this time with you today, and I'd like to thank you for joining us live from the Museum of the Rockies. My name is Jamie Oggs, and I'm the Outreach Program Manager, and I'll be your MC today. I'd like to introduce you to Michael Fox. He's our Curator of History here at the Museum of the Rockies. In just a few minutes, Michael will captivate us with information about Montana's agricultural history. Our friends and partners at Streamable Learning are also on hand. They will be assisting us with any IT needs. So if you can't hear us or you can't see us at this point, type into that chat box and be sure to let us know. We'll have a few minutes of stuff before Michael gets into the really neat information. Throughout, if you have questions, let us know. Type them into the chat box. If we're not able to respond right away, we'll be sure to get to those questions towards the end of the program. Type into that chat box if you've been to the Museum of the Rockies before. Anyone been here? You folks in Chester, Whitefish, do you ever make it down? Not sure. All right, well, we are in Bozeman, Montana. We're gonna pull a screen up that shows where that's at real quick. There you go. Bozeman is located about 80 miles north of the beautiful Yellowstone Park and 315 miles south of Canada. We're nestled in the beautiful and historic Gallatin Valley, right next to Montana State University. Those of you who have been here before will recognize the entrance to the museum. We have Big Mike, a famous T-Rex, greeting us as we come in. That looks a lot like today. It's super snowy. Warmer than it has been in the last couple of weeks, so we're happy about that, but we have received a ton of snow over the last couple of days. From here, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. He will lead you through some great information about agriculture in Montana. Thanks, Michael.
Sure. Well, hello there. Michael Fox. I'm the Curator of History here at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana. And as Jamie was just mentioning, we're having a little bit of a kind of a heat wave here, where last time I checked, we're up to about 15 degrees. Got probably 2.5, 3 feet of snow sitting on the ground and plenty of drifting out there. So it's a little bit treacherous. But if you imagine that it's not 2019 today, but 1899, and you were coming up to visit us here in Bozeman, you can imagine that your trip would be significantly different than if you were driving up to the museum this afternoon, because you would either be riding your horse or you would be in some type of a conveyance pulled by horses. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the relationship between horses and kind of Montana agricultural history and our cultural history up here as well. The first horses that came to the northern Rockies, that's, we usually think of that as Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. The first horses that came up here were brought here by native peoples. And of course, native peoples have been here for over 1,000 years. But during most of that time, they pursued the bison and other large game that was the basis of their culture on foot. And they did have draft animals, but they were dogs. They were big dogs, but nowhere near as big as the animals that they brought into the region in the late 1600s, early 1700s, when horses made their first appearance up here. They were brought by native peoples, brought them over here from the Great Lakes region and down south through Canada and up from the south. From New Mexico, Arizona, southern Colorado territory that was part of New Spain. And of course, it was the Spanish who brought the horses in from the south, and French and British colonists from the Great Lakes region. Those British colonists, of course, included people who would later become first Americans, first Euro-Americans, that is. When native peoples brought horses into the area, it really revolutionized the plains culture, particularly of hunting bison. Now, previously, of course, native people had hunting bison on foot, but that can be pretty tricky. Once you have a horse, of course, you can run right alongside them and really create a much more active culture based on following these bison herds. They also became the draft animals for native peoples too, who would carry all the native equipment, shelters, lodges, all of that stuff, pulled on travois, a triangular shaped little conveyance that was pulled behind a horse. So the native peoples, there are many different tribal groups in our northern Rocky Mountain region, but they all had a significant reliance on horses. It was, in fact, such a significant reliance that in the later days, when the United States government and the U.S. Army relegated these native peoples to their reservations, the first things they took away from them were their firearms and their horses. This basically forced these native peoples to stay on their reservations. And with the western expansion of Euro-American, basically the conquest of the northern Rocky Mountains, new types of horses started to come into the area. The first Euro-Americans in our region were generally explorers and fur traders, and these led to mining people as well. Basically, explorers and fur trappers discovered that there were precious minerals in our hills around here, and miners started to flood into the area. The first significant Euro-American incursions into the region that's the Northern Rockies now happened in the late 1850s, early 1860s, and were primarily driven by gold rushes. In Montana, our first one was 1862 up near Bannock, and the way that every single one of these potential millionaires, as they thought of themselves, miners coming into the region, the means by which they arrived here was through horse-drawn vehicles. These were different than the horses that most of the native peoples had up here. They tended to be bigger horses for pulling heavy loads. And this is the means by which these miners and all of the other peoples who were community builders brought their supplies up into these mining regions. Now that means pretty much any object that a person would own in our region, unless they made it here in Montana, it had to come by horse-drawn vehicle. The exception to that were people who lived along the Missouri River, which is northern part of Montana, and that was a navigable river. So supplies could come upriver up to the head of navigation, which was called Fort Benton. And supplies could be offloaded there, but to go anywhere further than Fort Benton, they had to be loaded onto horse-drawn vehicles. Now, the most popular kind of horse-drawn vehicle of the day would be what we consider to be a farm wagon. It's kind of like the pickup truck of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Usually these were kind of big rectangular wagons that had different numbers of slats on the sides that were kind of interlocking. So you could have a farm wagon that was relatively short bed, or a taller bed, or a very tall bed, depending on what type of groceries or hay or mining equipment that you were bringing into the region. A relatively quick offshoot of mining became Montana agriculture. That's because there were a large number of miners who came into the region who did not strike it rich. They were not the millionaires they thought they were going to be. But they looked around at regions like the Gallatin Valley, where Bozeman, Montana is located, the Ennis Valley, probably about 60 miles from here, and the Deer Lodge Valley, maybe about 120 miles, and along what's called the High Line, along the Montana-Canada border. And they saw that these places had tremendous potential for agriculture, and they jumped right on that. And for these guys, again, horses were their primary means of transportation, whether they were simply going back and forth between the few small settlements that existed in the area, or whether they were dragging their plow or their seeder or harvesting. Horsepower was tremendously important. So if you think about that, there quickly became a large number of horses in our region. So what did it mean to be a horse owner back in the 19th century, early 20th century? Well, it's a lot is very similar to the way it is today. They're expensive to keep up with, and they're a lot of work. You're constantly grooming them, cleaning them, feeding them, making sure they have water all year round, including winter, when everything is frozen. They require pretty much constant attention. And this was an activity that took place, again, on a very large scale. There were major farms and ranches in our region that did nothing but produce different varieties of horses, whether those were huge draft horses for work out in the field, or they were smaller horses for general riding purposes, or even race horses. Horse racing in our region has always been an important aspect of our culture, whether it was native peoples racing horses out on the prairie, or wealthy mining millionaires who were bringing their fine race horses out from Kentucky and racing them in the streets of Helena and Butte and Virginia City, some of our top mining communities. So you can see that there's very much of a whole economy here that's based on horses, the care of horses, and the activities of agricultural work that's directly related to these animals. Don't want to leave out mules here either. Mules were a critically important part of Montana and Northern Rockies work as well. Mules were ubiquitous with underground mine activities here, but also used in fields and actually rode as the same way that horses would be ridden as well. And there's great stories about mules in American history. One of the United States' most illustrious mule breeders was actually George Washington, who put a huge mammoth jack, a very large breed of donkey, up for stud. The royal jack had been a gift from the King of Spain back during Washington's days, named Royal Gift. And Washington put this giant donkey up for stud, and all of his neighbors came around and got huge mules from Royal Gift. This is a tradition that has been passed down, since American colonial days. Mules were a big part of day-to-day activities here in Montana back in those days. Now, for farmers and ranchers, this whole economy was really critical to their work because, of course, they had to have their own horses, but that meant that they had to grow feed for those horses that they could not otherwise plant with crops that they could sell. And every farmer and rancher ran their own hay operations, but also feedstocks as well. And these could be supplements to a farm or ranch business, ranch economy, because they could sell off whatever they had left over, whether that's hay or grain, to people who didn't have the opportunities to grow their own materials, people who lived in the cities and towns all over the state that were now growing. It also, this horse-based economy also embraced a large number of people who were not actively engaged in working with horses. So this would be everything from people who were selling hardware, who were selling horse and mule collars for agricultural implements specifically made for working with horses, harness makers, harness repairers, blacksmiths, wagon makers, wagon repairers, livery stables, feed stores, veterinarians, and the people who manufactured and sold veterinary medicines and different types of equipment. And of course, this doesn't even take into account the large numbers of breeders and horse sellers and horse traders who were all over the area. If you look at newspapers from these late 1800s, early 1900s, they are filled with people selling horses, putting horses up for stud. It was a very lively and active business here. It would not be overstating it to say that basically the Northern Rockies economy was horsepower driven, and horsepower by horses. But this began to basically change around 1905 or so. And one of the engines of this was actually the steam engine. The first large-scale steam powered tractors, called traction engines, or tractors as we call them nowadays, started showing up in the Northern Rockies in really the late 1880s, 1890s period. And that while the traction engine for agriculture had actually been developed back in the 1850s in Great Britain, it took a while to be created in such a way that it could be economical for farmers and ranchers in the Northern Plains. These things were huge, massive, lumbering, cumbersome monsters. They weighed in the range of 10 to 50 tons. And although they could produce a pretty significant amount of steam-powered horsepower, they tended to be a little finicky on the types of soils and terrains that we have out here in the northern Rockies and the Northern Plains as well. They also required some real professional operation and maintenance, because if you improperly operated these things, you could easily cause one to explode in a very spectacular fashion, showering everybody within 100 yards with pieces of steel shrapnel and burning hot steam and boiling water. Highly undesirable, and most people who are farm and agricultural people during this period, they weren't real experts with these types of steam engines. Of course, there were plenty of experts who were operating steam engines for other reasons in Montana, particularly in the mining industries, but in smaller industries as well, everything from light manufacturing to flour mills. Of course, we have many of those here in Montana. Again, small factories, even breweries were using steam-powered engines for a variety of different purposes here. So it was possible to find these specific technicians and steam engine operators. But right from the very beginning, these traction engines were very expensive. And one of the ways that communities in our region kind of tended to get around that was by pooling their resources. So a number of farmers or ranchers would all pool their funds to purchase one of these huge tractors, and usually a threshing machine to go with it. This is where the idea of the community threshing bee came from. The steam engine is hooked up to a huge threshing machine. They can put their grain into one end of the threshing machine, and it comes out as sorted grain. Chaff going out in one direction, and the sorted grain coming out the other side.
Michael, where did these steam engines come from? Where were they manufactured, and how did they get to Montana?
Excellent question. These huge monsters were actually made in the East. Chicago was a major manufacturing place, a couple different places in Michigan, even areas in Iowa, Waterloo, Iowa, one of the big areas that became John Deere headquarters out there. They were brought from back east. Later, there were a few California manufacturers as well. Case manufacturing company out there, and these were delivered by railroad. And our first major railroad connection here in Montana came in 1883, and that's probably one of the reasons why we didn't see many earlier than that. You're definitely not going to be packing one of these things on any type of a horse-drawn machine. So it really, the railroads had to get here before machines like this could be delivered. Now, as I mentioned, these huge steam engines were very expensive. Only if either the very, very wealthy farmers could afford them, or small communities would purchase them. But by about the 19-teens, we started seeing another type of engine coming around, and this is the gasoline-powered engine. Already, tractor manufacturers were working with the gasoline-powered engine as a way to compete against steam-powered tractors. But at the same time, automobiles were becoming a thing here. And our first automobiles up here in the Northern Rockies were seen around 1903, 1905. But in those days, again, very expensive. Only a very few select wealthy people could usually afford those. And they did require quite a bit of maintenance. and were not very well suited for our Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho roads, particularly in winter. But as time went on, what happened with both the traction engine business and automobiles is they, as more were produced and there were new upgrades and innovations that came with both the tractors and automobiles, they became less and less expensive. So more and more people could purchase them. And kind of an indication of this happened in about 1907, pretty early times, and that in our town of Bozeman was the year that the first automobile retailer opened in town, and it was opened by a wealthy art entrepreneur from town here named Story, Nelson Story. He opened Story Motor Supply here in Bozeman, selling automobiles. And ironically, it's that same year that the Montana legislature heard a bill before it that would have outlawed automobiles on all Montana roads. So clearly there is a disconnect between what people are doing in towns and cities and what the legislature thinks is going on. This legislation was voted down, and one of the main reasons was that there were enough people who were driving automobiles in the state at that time that they actively lobbied against this, said not only should you not outlaw them, you should be paying to upgrade these roads so that people like us who own automobiles can drive more safely around the region. And ultimately, that's what ended up happening. Again, during this time, automobile prices are going down and more people are purchasing them. And a major sign of the real change in the time took place at Yellowstone National Park, just about 80 miles south of us. In 1916, the park opened an entire season in the park that was open for automobiles. They'd had a few in 1915, but this was the first time that automobile transportation of any type was allowed in the park. And the 1916 season was kind of a disaster because they had basically all of the stagecoach traffic that are moving people around within the park are competing now with these clanking, noisy, smelly automobiles. The horses were terrified. There were lots of recorded runaways, a lot of problems there. And the way that the Park Service basically dealt with this is that in 1917, they outlawed all horse-drawn transportation. That forced the Yellowstone Transportation Company, which prior to this had run all the stagecoaches in the park, to basically sell off their entire fleet of stagecoaches, sell off all their horses, and purchase a brand new fleet of model 1917 white touring cars. It's a White Motor Company. And White Motor Company continued supplying touring cars and buses to both Yellowstone and Glacier National Park well into the 1950s. So this was really kind of a landmark year for automobiles throughout our region. The National Park Service had recognized that yes, the automobile and internal combustion engines were the way of the future, and that was really the way things were going to be in our region. By this time, the Montana legislature had actually come up with a licensing system for automobiles in the state. But in those days, you applied for an automobile license and they sent you a number, and you as the motorist were responsible for creating a license plate that has your number on it. Now, at about the same time, we're looking at 1916 or so, there's another major activity going on that is really occupying a lot of Americans' attention, and that is the World War going on over in Europe. Now, the United States enters the war in 1917, but prior to that, the state of Montana had been a major international supplier of horses to the British, French, Belgian armies. The United States Army operated a remount depot, basically a place that bred and raised horses specifically for the United States Army, for the cavalry, but also for draft animals for the artillery and for the quartermaster corps, and these horses were pulling wagons, they were pulling caissons, they were pulling artillery pieces in the field. So This place was located out in Miles City, out in eastern Montana, and during the period leading right up to World War I, there were well over 1 million horses that were delivered from Miles City all the way over to Europe. And if you know anything about the history of World War I, you know that it was a slaughterhouse for horses. And several million were killed in the war. And of those million-plus horses that left from the Montana remount station, very few, if any, ever returned. So by the 1920s, the price of these gasoline-powered tractors back here in the northern Rockies had really come down significantly, and they were starting to be purchased by individual farmers and ranchers rather than communally. The day of the giant steam tractors was very much coming to an end, and this really kind of revolutionized farming here. But in a booklet that was circulated by Montana State College, the extension office and part of the agriculture department here at what's now Montana State University, they put out a booklet, and you can see this. It's called Big Teams in Montana. And the image on the front here shows a couple of 20-horse teams pulling plows. So this came in 1925. By this time, a lot of Montana farmers are looking at tractors, at gasoline-powered tractors, as the way to go here. But in this booklet, it specifically states that the individual expressions favoring the big teams of horses instead of the tractor may be found in this bulletin, but it's not taken as a general condemnation of tractor farming, but rather as the experiences of men who found big teams more suited than tractors to their farm management scheme. Heavy initial costs and added upkeep costs on tractors are the reasons why the majority of farmers will be interested in expansion through big teams rather than tractors. And the publication goes on to demonstrate the ways in which very large teams of horses were employed in dry farming. And our dry farming took place for the most part in the eastern part of our state, but they're certainly extended through the western elements as well. And big teams were certainly used on irrigated farmsteads as well. These teams could be up to 20 to 40 horses put together into an individual team for plowing extremely large areas of generally grain crop areas. And I, as a historian, find that really interesting because this is a time and place where we're starting to see the beginnings of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Unlike the kind of generally accepted idea of the Great Depression starting in the early 30s across the nation, up here in the northern tier states, we started seeing effects of that as early as the very early 20s. And farmers and ranchers were very adept at keeping their economies going. They didn't want to get too overextended. They didn't want to build up too much debt. So at this time when some people are buying these gas-powered tractors, they're looking at some of the older methodologies of farming, looking at these big teams, because they can see there are difficult economic times coming. This is something that really drew out the period of this transition from the horsepower, and the adoption of gasoline-powered horsepower. So that's really our story of horsepower here in the Northern Rockies. If you have any questions, send them in right now. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have.
Michael, were the big team horses a certain type of horse? And were they bred specifically for these teams?
Excellent question. And the answer to that is it was a really wide variety. Large breeds like Clydesdales, Belgians, and Friesian horses were very well known in our area. You can look in newspapers and see, woodcuts of, Clydesdales being put up for stud. So these were horses that were specifically bred for large draft teams. However, it wasn't that usual to have for instance, a big Clydesdale team like the Budweiser Clydesdales. It was more likely that you would breed, you as a farmer would breed one of your mares with a larger horse in order to produce larger offspring. So you might buy 1 or 2 Clydesdales. You might have a matched team, but you would definitely want one of those to be for stud as well. So yes, the very large freight teams were certainly sought after, and if you were in a business that was dealing with something like routinely hauling large amounts of, say, mining machinery or freight from large distances, that's a direction that you might go. On the other hand, most farmers, they were less interested in the specific breeding of these types of horses for farm activities than they were with things like endurance and overall power. So they weren't that interested in creating huge match teams, but were more interested in being able to sustain their own force of horsepower there.
Are there still a large amount of horses in Montana?
There are, and we don't use them that much for really for hauling freight or for draft teams anymore, but horses are huge for recreational activities. There's a lot of horse packers that go into the mountains right here by Yellowstone, up in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. There are a lot of hunters who go out on horseback as well to access areas that are otherwise roadless. And there is a tremendous interest in horses on our American Indian reservations all across the state, and it's basically all tribes have a deep interest and long-term love of horses. There's even a circuit of Indian horse racing called Indian Relay that is very popular in our state, pretty much exclusively practiced by native tribes who put together teams of horses that are usually retired race horses to do basically racing teams around a track. The competition is very tough out here in Montana, and teams from our reservations here always are heading west to the national championships, which this year I believe are right outside of Pendleton, Oregon. But yes, there's still a tremendous interest in horses, both for commercial reasons, for recreation certainly, and for tribal and native peoples, basically recognizing and working with their own tribal histories and tribal cultures that, of course, were very heavily centralized on the horse.
Folks are wondering about all of these cool collection pieces in front of you.
Excellent. Sorry, I didn't mention that before. We pulled some items from the Museum of the Rockies collection that are kind of reflective of a little bit of our regional horse history. And I can just show you a few of these. This is a horsehair rope. This is actually a kind of a lariat piece. Let me just hold this up here. Made out of woven horsehair. This is an item called a hay knife. Whoa, there you go. And this is an implement that you use if you have a frozen haystack, as we would have right here outside today. And it's used for cutting a piece off of a frozen haystack. So you can chop a piece off and feed it to your horses or your cattle. This piece is actually a draft horse horseshoe, specifically for use on snow and ice. It's got big cleats on it. And this is definitely something you would see in Montana back in the horsepower days here. And of course, horses were used for other things like logging. So for instance, if you're logging in the winter, you're pulling logs out of the forest, this is something you would definitely want to have on your horse. This is a piece, these are the blinders and headstall for a horse that was pulling a Yellowstone Park Transportation Company stagecoach, and it has the Yellowstone Park Transportation Company monogram on it there. So this piece dates to probably about 1898 to about 1905. These were custom made for the transportation company, and these, again, along with the horses and the stagecoaches, were sold off by the transportation company in 1917. Got a hay hook here. This big, gnarly looking hook.
Sorry, wrong direction.
See it here. This is it's basically called a hay bale hook. So if you had a bale of hay, you would hold it like this and jab this into a bale of hay, and you could pull it up, lift it up, throw it on your pickup truck, and take it out and feed your horses or cattle. This is a curry comb. Should be pretty straightforward and recognizable to any horse owner for sure. This is used to basically clean the fur, and also to kind of massage the hide of the horse as well. Basically, it's a cleaning tool and something that you would have, that a horse owner would have used on a daily basis. And this item is a hoof parer, and you can see it. It's kind of a chisel-like action here on the front, which you'd use to trim horses' hooves as they got longer and longer, and actually has a little chisel point on this end of it for cleaning hooves. This end right here.
I am personally curious about this hoof packing.
This is hoof packing, and this is a veterinary medicine. On the cover here it says, draws out soreness associated with infections of the frog and sole, and those are parts of the interior part of a horse's hoof. So again, it's a veterinary preparation used on the hooves of horses. There were horses that were shod in Montana and other horses that were unshod in Montana. And it really depended on what type of work that they were, what type of work they were doing, whether it was in the field, whether it was hauling, a taxi cab around in Butte or Helena, or pulling a draft wagon. It all depended on the type of work that horse or mule was doing. Any other questions?
Last chance, type those questions in there. If you want to share, if you were a rancher or a farmer or owned horses back in the day, we'd love to hear that too.
There are a few places in the Northern Rockies that actually do still utilize horsepower for some types of primarily haying activities. There are a few down in central Wyoming, but an important one up here in Montana is the Grant Coors Ranch, that is a National Historic Property. It's over near Deer Lodge, and they still operate big teams, huge draft horses, and every year they harvest and put up their hay in big piles, exactly the same way as they did, back in about 1905. Definitely worth a look out there, and that is a place that really Montana horse history is always on display. So highly recommended if you want to make it out there.
Where was that again?
Grant Coors Historic Site, and it's a National Historic, I believe it's a National Historical Monument, and it's located over by Deer Lodge, Montana.
All right, well, Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, appreciate it, and we'll look forward to you next time.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Please let us know if you have any feedback. We are brand new to this and super excited to talk to you again on April 2nd. That's a Tuesday at 2:10 Mountain Standard Time or 4:10 Eastern Standard Time. We'll talk about Butte, the Silver City, the Copper Kingdom on that date. And then on Wednesday, May 1st, we will talk about Crow Fair and the TV capital of the world. Michael will be giving us all our information for both of those events. And again, if there's anything we should know about how we did today, please don't hesitate to let us know. Angie's gonna pull up my information, so please feel free to call, send an email. We want to hear how we did. We want to keep providing these for you and improve as we go. There's that information. So thank you so much. Join us again later on this spring.